This is Sunrise Sunset, and I'm back talking with Dr. Louis Rowitz from the University of Illinois School of Public Health Care. He's a professor there and also the editor of Mental Retardation, a nationally recognized journal. And we've been talking about the mentally retarded child and the parameters of what mental retardation is and the adaptive phases that a family goes through. And I think maybe, Lou, we should now kind of talk about an area that I don't hear people talking about very much, and that's what are the problems of the mentally retarded teenager, the mentally retarded adult? What is the experience of the family? I mean, a child, there's a certain amount of empathy or pity or, oh, you know, they're just children. They do grow up.
Okay, and I think we also have to talk about the mentally retarded elderly, since there are some elderly mentally retarded people these days.
Yeah.
Which end of the life cycle do you want to start with?
Well, we began at the beginning, so let's continue along that path.
You know, part of it relates to the whole issue of stereotypes in children, and I can think back to, or perhaps you could think back to the first dirty word that kids learn about. And I've heard 3-year-olds, for example, call each other stupid dummies, and it has a connotation of being a bad name. So those stereotypes occur very early. And so that often retarded youngsters find themselves ostracized at a very early age, not only by often by their brothers and sisters who have all sorts of problems dealing with guilt and not understanding why their brother or sister is not behaving like the other kids, and also by the stereotypes that the parents have that create all sorts of difficulties. The mother and father have certain ideas about what it's like to be a parent, and they bring these into the marriage situation, and there they're confronted with a handicapped child and don't quite know how to use the parenting skills that they thought they had in dealing with this child. So
are they also likely to think that they failed in their parenting because they had this child?
Okay, that differs a little bit by religion.
Okay, let's talk about that.
You want to talk about religion? Okay. I have to sort of be very careful here because the issue of religion hasn't been looked at in too much detail. It goes back pretty much into the 50s and 60s, where there was a religious revival in the country, and suddenly everybody was interested in finding out
what religious groups were
doing for what group. And what they found out at that point in time is that there were differences. For example, Jewish parents tended to institutionalize their retarded children much more quickly than other religious groups.
Because the concept of shame was stronger?
Not so much the concept of shame as the concept of social mobility, that a handicapped child holds you back, and very often after World War II, the Jewish family, second-generation Jewish families, were very upwardly mobile. And the child, and they couldn't deal very often with what it meant to have a handicapped child in the household. And so what we found, at least at that point in time, was a tendency to reject this child and institutionalize the child. It was much easier to institutionalize a handicapped child of any level of retardation through the 40s and 50s. Then the deinstitutionalization movement, and it became harder and harder to institutionalize children. Also, there are certain forms of mental retardation that are primarily associated with particular religious groups. For example, Tay-Sachs disease is primarily a disorder associated with children of Jewish parents. And there's some theory that it's only Jewish parents whose relatives had come from one section of Eastern Europe.
I thought there were 2 forms. One that was late onset, came from 9 or 10. That there are really 2 kinds of Tay-Sachs, and there's one that's early onset, and it's Ashkenazic, and then there's another one, 2 different communities.
Well, it seems to be only right from certain sections. And it's often called in literature lipid storage disease is another name for Tay-Sachs. But we have Tay-Sachs screening programs, and there's some
but that the child does not survive.
No, child doesn't survive. Child is born normal.
Right.
And suffers complete deterioration of the brain by age 5.
But that's not a child who survives in a family, so that they have an end point.
They have an end point. But the stresses on marriage are very extreme. And often, once you have a Tay-Sachs child, the chances of another Tay-Sachs are greatly increased.
How do other religious groups respond?
Okay. Catholic families tend to, at least in terms of the literature of 20 years ago, react as not so much in terms of guilt as this is God wants me to take care of this child. Right. There is a reason why this child was born to me, and that is something that I have a responsibility to do.
It's a task, God
It's a task. And the burdens that are often put on the family as a result of that are often very extreme. The Protestant families have mixed reactions, depending on whether or not
they're not a homogeneous
no,
group.
Some of the groups look at it as guilt, as they sinned, and there was some reason why this child was born to them. And so there's a lot of guilt involved. So that's basically all that the literature has said. The part that I think is more interesting relative to this is how do retarded children learn religion? And I would argue that they probably learn religion the same way that normal children do. They're socialized into certain sorts of religious activities. Their parents take them to services or to the church or synagogue on a regular basis. They learn them as young children would learn all religious sorts of things.
5- and 6-year-olds are naturals for religious schools, so right. It would not be necessary to deprive a mentally retarded child or adult of the religious experience.
That's correct. Yeah. That's correct. The issue, is often one of values and morals, and sometimes the retarded child, being much more religious than his parents, often put his parents on the spot.
Why did you do that?
Why did you do that?
When you told me I can't do this.
That's correct.
Yes, they have a kind of concrete
That's right.
way of looking at things without the subtleties which they may not develop.
Okay. The issue of concrete and abstract is yes. interesting also, because different classes within society learn those concrete and abstract thinking processes in different ways. The middle class is oriented towards abstract thinking, and so is the educational system. Right. The lower class is primarily oriented towards concrete thinking, and that's one of the reasons the theory is that they have trouble with IQ tests, which is based on abstract reasoning.
And might also be one of the reasons why they're labeled as mentally retarded, because they're oriented to a different kind of thinking. That's right. A mildly retarded or a moderately retarded adolescent, they physiologically mature in the same way or at the same rate? Actually, mildly retarded would
mildly
be
retarded probably would.
Okay.
Moderately retarded would probably be a little slower. It depends on the particular disorder that the child has. A Down syndrome child develops differently than perhaps a normal child would. The major problem with teens is the same problem that you have with teens the world over, and that's the whole issue of teenage sexuality. And how do you deal with the issue of sexuality and learning about various types of sexual options if you are retarded?
Well, not only that, isn't the family also, if they have in their heads that you are mental age 8 and you have physically matured and you are really 15 or 16, isn't there a difficulty with the family just acknowledging that you are sexual?
Yes. Yes, and in the past there was an option in many states for parents. What they tended to do was sterilize their retarded daughters. And that was legal in many states for many years. It is not legal
anywhere?
I'm not sure about that, but I know it's not legal in most states any longer. Because you can now, a retarded young woman, there are several cases where retarded young woman, in reaching adulthood, finding out that she has been sterilized, has the right to sue her parents. And there are several cases on record of suits against parents for sterilization of their children when they were younger. That used to be the option. The reality is mildly and moderately retarded people will have sexual orientations of various kinds. Severely and profoundly retarded just physically may have some difficulties with sexuality.
When this sexuality arises in the family, I mean, adolescence is a difficult time in a normal family.
Yes.
What kinds of problems does this present to the parents, to the family? Do they try to hide it? Do
well,
they
the
try
parents
to
tend to ignore
okay.
usually. There's some of the more interesting effect of clinicians in dealing with this is how do you teach retarded people about sex? What sorts of information do you need to give to children who are retarded? And we get into a very interesting ethical issue. If you are unable to read at a certain level, you're going to have trouble reading a sex manual or finding out about physiology. One of the things that's occurred in the field has been a concern with using visual sorts of aids, in other words, showing films. But as soon as you can move into the visual area, you get caught up in pornography. So the question is, can you show a film to somebody for sex education without getting caught up in legal issues of pornography?
Well, it seems to me that pornography is a thing of the mind.
Correct.
I mean, it's how you perceive it.
Right.
And although you may be watching a film that you think is pornography, the person who is retarded watching that film will not even have that concept.
But school boards and parent-teachers associations
are not really as
and
city
council members often prevent these films from being shown. The films are available. I've seen a number of them.
Swedish films, it seems to me?
No, there are also films that have been made in this country that are available for teaching sexuality to handicapped people. But the major concern is the showing of films. It's interesting. They will allow you to read a book, but they will not allow you to see it visually. This creates sort of
pictures in a book are no good either?
It's usually not. You remember the play over some of the books in recent years, Joy of Sex, and some of these other books which have affected parental attitudes. The parents are afraid that their retarded daughter is going to get pregnant. The issue very often may very well be that you may have to demonstrate certain types of sexual outlets for young people. One of the men up at the University of Minnesota, Russell Goodman, has argued that sometimes a clinician may be under an obligation to actually show a young retarded male how to masturbate. That this is something that may not be natural, but may be something you have to actually demonstrate. This then means that the clinician has to deal with his or her own sexuality before they can also deal with the sexuality of the handicapped people that they're dealing with. Also, one of the more controversial parts of the field is there is some evidence of homosexuality among retarded males, mainly because they have so much difficulty in dealing with opposite sex relationships that sometimes the only sexual outlets that are often available to them within institutions are homosexual. And this creates all sorts of moral issues regarding whether or not this type of sexuality is acceptable in a handicapped population, especially when we can't deal with it in normal populations.
Well, have we gone beyond the point of asking the question whether or not a mentally retarded adult is entitled to their sexuality? It seems to me that some years ago that was an issue. I mean, are they going to be allowed to have sexual relations with one another? Will they produce a mentally retarded child if they marry? Should there be some curbs on this? I mean, where are we now in terms of the whole question of, yes, they are sexual, and what are we going to do about it?
I think we have a whole segment of the service providing population that says, yes, we've gone beyond that point. I don't think we really have. We're still dealing with problems with parents, we're dealing with administrators, we're dealing with all sorts of groups that say the mentally retarded are not entitled to having sexual feelings. This is something that is
Are they entitled to marry?
In most areas, no. Although there are cases now of retarded people who are getting married. There was an interesting TV film a couple of years ago called Like Normal People, which dealt with the marriage of a retarded couple. I recently was asked to just look through the literature over the last 15 or 20 years and see how many articles there are, and I found less than a handful dealing with marriage among the mentally retarded. The interesting sidelight to all of that is that there was a study done in California called the Cloak of Competence, which showed a very interesting phenomenon, that often normal males will marry retarded females that it did something for the normal male self-image to have a wife that they felt would never be brighter than they are.
I was telling someone that the other day who has a daughter who's mildly retarded, and he didn't believe me. Does it work the other way around?
Not very often. Not very often. We still are caught up in our society with the definite concepts of sex roles that have very much affected even the marriage situation among the retarded. With the retarded adult who's living in the community, they often, when they're first deinstitutionalized, which means that they leave an institution, they tend to look for benefactors in the community who protect them for a period of time until they become adjusted to the community. And mentally retarded adults often learn how to work the system. So while they have a job when they first go into the community, 20 years later, or they're often on welfare because they've learned the welfare system and find that they don't have to work in order to get money on a regular basis. And this is the follow-up to cloaca competence, which was, I think it was done 15 years afterwards, found they know that the mentally retarded, mildly mentally retarded adults often were no longer working, knew the welfare system, and were much happier than they had been 15 years before.
So in their own way, they had used intelligence.
Used intelligence to work the system, yes.
If you were the parent of a mildly retarded, now there's some points in there. I mean, it's not just 70.
Yes.
It's about 60 to 70, isn't it?
Well, 55.
55 to 70. If you were the parent of a mildly retarded adult, 18, 19, 20, 21, 22, would you encourage or should you encourage that child or that adult to leave home and set up on their own? Or should you have a protective umbrella as long as you can for that person? Okay,
remember earlier I talked about the issue of least restrictive environment. What this means is that the least restrictive environment is independent living. And you go from least independent living all the way up to, say, a nursing home environment, which is probably the most restrictive. The answer to your question would be yes, that if the young person is able to survive within the community, it is better for that individual to make it on his own, if at all possible. Now, it may be that they can't live completely independently, but there are options such as group homes.
And are there more and more of those?
There are more and more of those in other states. Illinois is one of the states that has been the slowest to develop the group home. It is much more prevalent in other parts of the country, and they're just beginning to get underway in Illinois. And what they are small homes with usually under 15 people living in them. The other possibility is scattered housing, which is 2 or 3 handicapped people living together in an apartment.
Under some sort of supervision?
Under some sort of supervision where somebody would check up on them on a regular basis, so they would live in the apartment, perhaps go to a workshop or some job during the day, and would develop some semblance of a normal round of life. So there are many more adult retarded, mildly and even moderately retarded now, who are living within the community apart from their families.
We were talking in the first half of the show about how in the elimination phase of the adaptation process, somebody leaves the family, like a husband can leave because a mother has devoted so much caretaking to the child that the husband has been excluded, or that sibs can escape the atmosphere of the family, things like that. Is it difficult if a family has been a home-centered family, one that has pulled the walls in or something like that, to give up this child? I mean, to say, if you're on your own, or we're here a telephone away, but leave?
I would say yes. If somebody a family is so oriented its whole life to a particular child and maintaining the child in a childlike role, I think the answer is yes. If that child goes out of the household, it disrupts the whole family coping mechanism.
The roles.
The roles.
All the roles have changed.
I think a reality for families is to be able to find ways to make their handicapped individual as independent as possible.
From the beginning.
From the beginning.
Set that as a family pattern. Is we're going to maximize what it is this child can do, and we're not going to depend upon the development of this child for our own growth.
Right. See, a family gets caught in something called a courtesy stigma very early.
A courtesy stigma?
A courtesy stigma.
I've never heard that.
It means that if you're handicapped, if you have a handicapped child, the rest of the family is guilty by association. And they get a stigma by society just because that handicapped person is in the household. So the family often feels ostracized from the community because of this stigmatic quality that is tied into the whole family system. And it's called courtesy stigma. And it affects not only the parents but the other siblings. And it affects the siblings in a unique manner. They tend to go into the helping professions.
Yes.
So that young women who have retarded brothers or sisters may become social workers or psychologists or physicians. Same thing for young men.
Feeling that they have had certain kinds of life experiences.
That would make them better able to help others.
Actually, I can think of several students I've had who fall exactly into that category. Is that a kind of repetition mechanism of maybe I can make it better for somebody else because I couldn't make it better in my family? I mean,
I don't know. It's an interesting hypothesis. It may very well be that I could never deal with my brother.
Right.
Maybe I can help others, and it's a way of getting rid of your guilt. Right.
Well, not only the guilt, but sort of I couldn't do it for him, but maybe I can do it for somebody else, and I'm going to keep on trying until I succeed. It sounded to me like that was possible. We were going to talk about the mentally retarded elderly.
Right. That's the last group.
Well, wait a minute. Maybe it isn't. Is there a midlife crisis for the mentally retarded in the same way?
Often retarded people, at least from what we're seeing thus far, move from adolescence to old age and don't have the middle stages.
They don't have...
They often don't have that adult stage. I mean, they're often in sheltered workshops. They're living in their family situation or in a sheltered situation. Suddenly at 45, there's no more sheltered workshop. They often...
Why?
Sometimes the money over the last several years, there's been a lot of retrenchment, and it has affected a lot of human services. But often, they almost skip that middle age period completely. I mean, they do go into adulthood, but the middle age period just seems to disappear, and they move from that young adult period into old, often beginning at age 45. What happens is you almost have a triple jeopardy situation. And what I mean by that is, and other people have talked about this, not only are you retarded, and you're stigmatized because you're retarded, you're also stigmatized because you're old, and third, you're stigmatized because you don't have any money. So you get almost a triple jeopardy situation for some of these people. But an interesting thing has happened in some of the literature, and some of what I'm finding in talking to people who are working in the field. A retarded old person may end up in a nursing home, and for the first time in their life find people to socialize with, so that the nursing home may become a positive experience for a retarded person who's been isolated in the community, is now within a closed community with people with whom to interact. And so it tends to have very positive effects on some elderly retarded people.
To the extent that their personalities change, or
their
that
personalities
they adapt better?
They become more social. They find it easier to adapt. They find activities.
But isn't that sad? Because it could have been done when they were
Much
younger.
earlier.
Obviously, they were adaptable enough to do it.
That's correct.
And here they're doing it as elderly, and they've wasted all that time.
Right. And then you've got all the problems with nursing homes in general, not providing many services anyway. But more, with life lengthening, it's been lengthening for the retarded as well as for everybody else in the population. So
is the median age of death different for the mentally retarded?
It's younger, but it is increasing. You have to exclude the mildly retarded now, who after age 18 are probably normal as far as society is concerned. So once they blend into the population, you lose them. The severely and profoundly retarded people will probably die younger. At least from what we're seeing. But their lifespans are much increased over what they were a generation ago. Down syndrome, which are usually somewhere between moderate and severely retarded, we're dying of respiratory infections, not a decade, but a generation ago. But because of the antibiotics and so forth, they're living much longer into their 40s and 50s very often.
I have an ethical question before we close this fascinating discussion, and that is, we seem to be polluting our gene pools in a lot of ways. Are there going to be more and more people who are mentally retarded because there has not been genetic counseling before marriage, or because people simply take their chances with the roulette wheel of conception? would you agree, first of all, that we are increasingly polluting our gene pool, whether it's from drug experience as teenagers or just the fact that people, neonatology saves a lot of marginal lives, and then these people go on to pass on other things? I mean, it's a loaded question, I know it.
And I'm going to give you a loaded answer, I think. I think there are checks and balances within the system.
Okay.
I think if you were to look at the overall distribution of, say, mental retardation in the population as a whole, it hasn't changed that significantly over time.
Okay.
The number of people may change. I mean, if the population increases, you will just by numbers see more,
right,
and the percentage may not change at all.
So you don't think that the percentage has changed that much?
Not significantly. I think the only thing that's going to change it is if you change your definition. And if anything, I think the infant mortality rates have declined somewhat. And as infant mortality rates are declining, we're doing much better in the area of prenatal care and so forth. I think that there are going to continue to be retarded people, but I don't at this point see a massive increase in the number of retarded people.
Quick question. With the advent of women waiting to have their children now in terms of their career and late first births, are we going to see more Downs?
You may, because as you know, the incidence of Downs increases for women over 35. And, you can do a test. You can do an amniocentesis, for example, and find out whether or not the woman is going to deliver a Downs child. And I realize that that's also very controversial and depends on the particular state you're in. There are several states now that do require or do recommend an amniocentesis for all women over 35.
I want to thank you. I think you've taught a lot of people a lot of things today. I know you've taught me a lot. My guest today has been Dr. Lewis Rowitz from the University of Illinois School of Public Health Care, and we have been talking about mental retardation. This is Audrey Gordon, Sunrise, Sunset, the Jewish Family in Transition, and thank you.